I never thought much about being in the local newspaper when I was 11. It was just a small feature about our school's craft fair fundraiser. Me and my friends from the dance team, smiling as we showed off the trinkets we'd made to sell. September came around, bringing my 12th birthday and an unexpected card in the mail. The card itself seemed ordinary enough, but inside I found intricate drawings, carefully written poems, and various messages decorated with stickers. It was signed simply Whitman. Something about the name struck me as odd. It seemed to mesh with my own surname in an unsettling way, like puzzle pieces that shouldn't fit together, but somehow did. A few days later, the ice cream vendor mentioned hearing my name on the radio. Someone had called in to dedicate a song to me. I hadn't heard it myself, but the thought of an unknown person reaching out through the airwaves made my skin crawl. The next contact came in the form of a postcard from Valencia. The image showed a traditional Spanish dancer frozen mid-twirl, her dress a swirl of vivid reds and blacks. The back was covered in more poetry and decorative elements, again signed Whitman. None of my classmates traveled abroad during the school term, and my parents began exchanging worried glances whenever the mail arrived. The final card arrived on an otherwise normal Tuesday afternoon. My parents watched as I opened it, but I quickly tried to hide its contents. My father took it from my trembling hands. Inside were 2 explicit photographs of a woman taped facing each other. No poems this time, no artwork, just the images that no 12-year-old should see. My father went straight to the police station with all the correspondence, but they never found the sender. Years later, memories surfaced during a family discussion. The summer before the cards began, we had visited relatives up north. My mother's cousin Nathan had been there, a quiet man in his 30s who always seemed to gravitate toward me. I remembered how he would invite me to listen to records in the study, away from everyone else. There was one night that still haunts me. I lay in bed, pretending to sleep as footsteps creaked up the stairs, and the door opened and I heard him whisper my name into the darkness before retreating. My aunt later confirmed she'd noticed his strange fixation with me during that visit. She had even confronted him about it, reminding him firmly of my age. When my mother mentioned his last name recently, my blood ran cold. Combined with my surname, it spelled out Whitman perfectly. The timing of the newspaper photo may have been coincidental, since Nathan lived in another region, but everything else aligned too perfectly. The careful artwork, the progression from innocent messages to something sinister, the way that he had tested boundaries that summer, it all pointed to him. Some family members suggested we report our suspicions, but too much time had passed. The evidence was long gone, and Nathan had moved away years ago. I've spent countless nights wondering if he's still out there, if he found other young girls to fixate on after me. Sometimes I dream about those footsteps on the stairs, about the whispered name in the darkness, and I wake up, grateful that the card stopped when they did. But I can't help thinking about what might have happened if my parents hadn't been there when that final envelope arrived. These days, I carefully monitor my own children's social media and teach them about boundaries. I know firsthand how a simple photo in a local paper can catch the wrong person's attention. The experience taught me that danger doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it lurks within the family tree itself, hiding behind kind smiles and shared surnames. I never imagined my first job after college would turn into a nightmare. At 20, I landed what seemed like a simple position as an administrative assistant at Marshall & Reed Consulting. My daily routine consisted of making coffee, photocopying documents, and answering phones. Nothing extraordinary. Everything changed during my 5th month there. Returning from lunch one afternoon, I discovered an unsigned card on my desk. The message inside was simple enough. I enjoy working with you. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was just a friendly gesture from a coworker. 4 days later, a bouquet of roses appeared on my desk. Again, no signature. I remember feeling more curious than concerned, secretly hoping they were from Nathan, the attractive accountant who worked nearby. Looking back, I wish I'd recognized these as the first warning signs. My living situation at the time complicated things. I split my time between my mother's house, my grandmother's place, and occasionally crashed at my friend Lily's apartment when I needed space. This scattered existence made what happened next even more unsettling. 2 weeks after the office flowers, I received a strange card in the mail at my mother's house. The sender had meticulously glued jelly beans to the envelope, my favorite candy, though I'd never mentioned this at work. The message inside called me Blondie and praised me as brilliant. The familiarity of the tone sent a chill down my spine. The stalking escalated quickly. 3 days later, a hand-delivered card arrived at my grandmother's house. The message, constructed from cut-out magazine letters, commented on my appearance. I realized then that someone was tracking my movements between residences. More cards followed, each more disturbing than the last. They contained crude sketches of me in places I'd recently visited, at a cafe, walking through the park, meeting friends at restaurants. The artist was watching me, documenting my daily life without my knowledge. I approached the police with a collection of 12 cards, but they couldn't do much without concrete evidence of who was behind them. At work, I posted all the cards on the bulletin board with a plea for the sender to stop. My manager granted me 2 weeks of leave, but the harassment continued. For 5 more weeks, cards arrived every other day. The messages grew increasingly explicit and threatening. My mother and grandmother installed security cameras, which seemed to deter deliveries to their homes. However, the stalker simply shifted tactics, sending flowers to Lily's address instead. The florist delivery provided the breakthrough we needed. Working with police, we traced the order back to its source. The revelation left me cold. My stalker was Harold Jenkins, a 63-year-old colleague who worked in accounting. He sat just 30 feet from my desk every day, watching, planning. A police investigation of his computer revealed hundreds of photos of me saved from social media. They found my picture in his wallet. Despite the psychological trauma he caused, his only punishment was termination from his job and a restraining order. I left that position soon after, but the experience changed me forever. Security cameras still monitor my home, and I'm careful about what I share online. Sometimes I catch myself scanning crowds, wondering if he's there. The card stopped, but the unease never has. I was 13 when everything changed. I had just started dating Jason, a quiet kid I met at my community center. He wore glasses and loved video games. When he asked me out, it felt like I had won some kind of lottery. Another girl had been flirting with him, so I was flattered he chose me, but at home, things were falling apart. My relationship with my parents was strained, and I had been dealing with dark thoughts. I didn't want to tell them about my struggles. I didn't want to worry them, but for a while Jason was my escape. That was until he started hanging out with Emily. I can't remember how Jason met Emily. It felt like she just appeared one day. Whenever Jason and I fought, he would reach out to Emily for comfort. That made my stomach twist. We mostly communicated through text, since he lived about 30 minutes away. I saw him a couple of times a week, usually on weekends. He often mentioned how funny Emily was, but she didn't seem to like me. It was confusing since I had never spoken to her. The first time I encountered Emily was during a fight with Jason. We were arguing over something silly when I received a text from her. I don't remember her exact words, but she insulted me, saying I didn't deserve Jason, and made a comment about my struggles. I fired back with my own harsh words. After that, my phone buzzed with call after call from her. I ignored them, feeling a mix of anger and hurt. I told Jason what happened, and he assured me he'd handle it. For a little while, I thought it was over, but something told me things were about to get worse. My second run-in with Emily happened one summer afternoon. Jason and I had just spent the day together. He left his laptop open when he went to the kitchen, and I thought I'd check my social media. Instead, I stumbled upon a chat with Emily. As I scrolled, I was shocked to see a series of provocative images. When Jason returned, I confronted him. He dismissed her actions, claiming she was just trying to stir trouble. The third time I crossed paths with Emily was at the local library. I was there with my mom and sister, lost in the world of books. Then I saw her at the checkout desk. She locked eyes with me, and I froze. I didn't recognize her at first, but then it hit me. I felt annoyed and uncomfortable. Instead of browsing books, I clung to my sister. Emily's gaze was intense. As we were leaving, my mom chatted with Emily. I was surprised at how polite and friendly she seemed compared to the girl I knew online. I felt guilty about how I had treated her before, so I decided to reach out and apologize later that night. But when I texted her, the response was anything but friendly. She called me hurtful names and told me I didn't deserve to be with Jason. Her words cut deep. I felt broken, crying for hours after reading her message. I called Jason, pleading with him to cut her off for good, but he didn't. I was stuck in this cycle of torment, with no way out. As the weeks went by, Emily's threats escalated. She said things like, "I'll make you pay for this." I didn't take her seriously. I was more upset than scared. My mental health was plummeting, and I started avoiding places where I might run into her. Jason and I continued our relationship, but the shadow of Emily hung over us. One day, after a huge fight with my mom, I felt the need to get away. I decided to go for a run, leaving my phone behind. I ran for a couple of hours. When I returned home, my phone was buzzing with messages from Jason, worried about where I had been. I explained everything, but I hadn't blocked Emily yet. As usual, she messaged me with her insults. This time she threatened me again, saying she knew where I lived. I read her reply and felt a chill. She had my address. Suddenly this felt real. I called Jason, crying and begging him to block her. He insisted on talking to her. I felt abandoned. I never contacted Emily again, but I couldn't shake the fear. New girls came and went, but none were as menacing as Emily. After over a year, Jason and I ended our relationship. In one of my last messages to him, I mentioned Emily and her relentless attacks. Time passed and we occasionally spoke, but things had changed. Looking back, I realize how serious Emily's actions were. I didn't understand the extent of her obsession back then. She had done her research, tracking me down to my local library, which still gives me chills. I wonder what she could have done if I hadn't put a stop to it. I hope no one else has to go through what I experienced. To the girl who couldn't let go of my boyfriend and stalked me relentlessly, let's not meet again. I was 15 when I started dating Clara. She was the kind of girl who lit up a room, always surrounded by friends and talking to various guys online. I didn't mind at first. I felt lucky to be with her, and I wanted to trust her completely. But there was one guy, Jake, who had been in her life before we got together. He was 25 and lived about an hour away. They had met once, but their connection was mostly through messages and video calls. As time went on, Jake's behavior grew unsettling. He started telling Clara that he loved her, insisting they were meant to be together. I noticed Clara pulling away, but instead of backing off, Jake intensified his messages. He sent her late-night texts filled with emotional pleas. I watched Clara become more anxious as he declared his feelings, and I felt a knot in my stomach tighten each time she received a message from him. I started to feel paranoid, always glancing at her phone whenever it buzzed. It reached a point where Jake began threatening Clara. He said he would come for her if she didn't respond to him. The tension escalated, and every message became a new source of dread. I began to notice Jake's car everywhere. I imagined it lurking in the shadows, just waiting to ambush us. The world outside seemed darker, more dangerous, and we felt trapped in our own lives. One day Clara showed up at my house, her face pale and her hands shaking. She was on the phone with Jake, and his voice echoed through the room. I could hear the desperation and rage in his tone. I felt a cold sweat forming as I listened to his words. He screamed threats that made my heart race. If I can't have you, then nobody can. The more he spoke, the more the reality of the situation sank in. It felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I could sense Clara's fear. It was almost palpable. When she muted the phone, she explained how Jake had contacted her the previous night, crying and threatening to harm himself. The idea of someone reaching that level of desperation terrified me. It was hard to fathom the weight of that threat. I didn't want to involve our parents, fearing they wouldn't understand, so we kept quiet, hoping the situation would resolve itself. As the days turned into weeks, I could feel the paranoia wrapping around us like a thick fog. We always scanned our surroundings, looking for his car or any sign of him nearby. Every shadow felt like a lurking presence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching us. One night, the fear reached its peak. Clara and I were sitting in my living room trying to distract ourselves with a movie. The flickering light from the screen barely touched the dark corners of the room. Suddenly, the sound of a car door slamming outside jolted us both. My heart dropped. I crept to the window, my breath hitching as I peered outside. A car was parked across the street and the driver was getting out. I squinted, trying to get a better look, and I felt the blood drain from my face. The figure was familiar, and the headlights illuminated the outline of a man who resembled Jake. I backed away from the window, trying to remain calm for Clara's sake. I didn't want to alarm her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our nightmare was right outside. I sat back down, but the tension in the room was suffocating. Clara sensed something was wrong and glanced toward the window. Every creak of the house made my skin crawl. I thought of Jake's words, the threats that had haunted us for so long. I wondered what he wanted. Did he plan to confront us? Was he really capable of violence? After a few agonizing minutes, the car drove away. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. But the moment of relief was short-lived. The shadows still loomed, and the fear refused to leave. The next day, Clara and I decided to take action. We researched ways to protect ourselves. We found a self-defense class nearby and signed up. The idea of being prepared gave us a sliver of hope. I felt a spark of determination ignite within me. I couldn't let fear control my life. As we practiced techniques, I felt more empowered. The instructors taught us how to stay aware of our surroundings and what to do if we ever found ourselves in danger. With each class, I could see Clara growing stronger, too. Her confidence was returning, and I could feel the bond between us deepening. One evening, as we walked home from class, I felt a sense of unease settle over me again. The streets were quiet, and the sun had set, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for us. I stayed alert. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump. Just as we turned a corner, I noticed a familiar car parked a few blocks ahead. It was Jake's car. Panic surged through me, and I instinctively grabbed Clara's hand. We picked up our pace, glancing over our shoulders as we walked. We needed to get home. Every instinct told me to run. I couldn't shake the image of Jake lurking nearby, waiting for the right moment to strike. As we reached my house, I glanced back one last time. The car remained where it was, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Once inside, I locked the door and took a deep breath. Clara leaned against the wall, her face pale again. That night we barely slept. Every sound outside sent us into a panic. I wondered if Jake was really out there waiting. I had no way of knowing, but I was determined to keep Clara safe. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to a new normal. We continued our self-defense classes, and our confidence grew. Clara's laughter started to fill the air again, and I felt lighter. One day, while we were walking home from class, a car pulled up beside us, and I instinctively positioned myself in front of Clara. But as the window rolled down, I realized it was just a friendly face from school. As time passed, the fear of Jake faded, but I knew I would never forget the tension we had faced together. Clara and I had become stronger, not just as individuals, but as a team. We had faced darkness and come out the other side, ready to embrace life again. I never meant for any of this to happen. Moving into the old Victorian house on Maple Street seemed like the perfect fresh start after my divorce. The previous owner, Mrs. Harrison, had passed away without any heirs, and the price was surprisingly reasonable, perhaps too reasonable looking back. The first strange occurrence came 3 days after I moved in. A pristine white box tied with a black ribbon appeared on my doorstep. Inside were handmade dark chocolates arranged in the shape of a heart. The note simply read, "Welcome home." I assumed it was from one of my new neighbors trying to be friendly. The gifts continued appearing every few days, each one more elaborate than the last. A vintage pocket watch, an antique music box that played a haunting melody I couldn't quite place, a leather-bound journal filled with blank pages. The notes became more personal, mentioning details about my daily routine that only someone watching me would know. I installed security cameras, but they never caught anyone approaching my door. The gifts would simply appear, as if materializing out of thin air. I started having trouble sleeping, constantly checking the windows and jumping at every creak of the old house settling. My neighbor Sarah began stopping by more frequently, bringing casseroles and asking if I was adjusting well to the neighborhood. Her concerned eyes studied my increasingly haggard appearance. I noticed she always seemed to linger near the hallway leading to the basement, her gaze drawn to the heavy wooden door that remained perpetually locked. That night I found another gift, a brass key that perfectly matched the basement door's lock. The note read, "Come find me." The basement steps creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. My flashlight beam revealed walls covered in faded photographs. Hundreds of them. They were all of me, taken over the past month. Sleeping, eating, working. Some were even from inside the house. In the center of the room stood an old vanity mirror. As I approached, I saw movement in its reflection that didn't match my own. A figure in a black dress stepped out of the shadows behind me. Mrs. Harrison's familiar face smiled back at me, but her eyes were completely black. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The temperature plummeted as she drew closer. Her ice-cold hands cupped my face as she whispered, "I've chosen you as my replacement. The house must always have a keeper." Now I understand why the real estate agent was so eager to sell, why the price was so low. I've become part of the house, watching new residents come and go, leaving them little gifts, choosing the next keeper. The cycle continues, and I can never leave. Sometimes Sarah still brings casseroles to the new owner. She glances up at my bedroom window, and I think she knows. She sees me standing there, but she never says a word. After all, every neighborhood has its secrets, and some gifts come with strings attached.